Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 41. Ever get into a conversation that leaves your brain feeling like it just ran a marathon? Not because it was boring, but because it challenged everything you thought you knew.
About whatever, Black Lives Matter, abortion,
sociology,
immigration.
higher education
It
obviously
now becomes
skews left, and then
impossible
within
to
higher
have
education,
so many
sociology
assumptions
is-
to say we can't even ask these questions.
anyone,
And the gap
would,
is
like,
not
of course you would
information.
treat them with respect and dignity.
These conversations can be frustrating, sure, but sometimes a little mental discomfort is exactly what we need. Because in today's world of constant pronouncements and unwavering opinions, what if absolute certainty is actually holding us back? That's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and today we'll be joined by a leading expert on the psychology of certainty, who will challenge our assumptions about what it means to know something.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm based in Champaign, Illinois, which is where I am now. My full-time job is I'm on the faculty in the sociology department at the University of Illinois. My standard academic background is I have a joint degree in demography and sociology from Penn, and I studied immigration for a long time, so for about a decade, and just but in a very dry academic sense, and just kind of wrote papers that nobody read, and that was fine. But what I noticed over the last decade or sort of was it was more just a sense that the conversations around me, whether it was sort of at a societal level in my own department in sociology, I mean, higher education obviously skews left, and then within higher education, sociology is like super to the left, right? I mean, we're as far left as you go. And just seeing how these conversations were unfolding, both in my own life and sort of my own professional life and outside, that in the beginning, it seemed like I was kind of like everyone had gotten a memo that I didn't get, like about like, okay, here are the things that we believe, and here are the things that we assume about the world and about people's intent and about identity and about discrimination and inequality and racism and everybody seemed to be on the same page. And I was like, this doesn't make any sense to me. And so over time, just sort of listening and paying attention, I did start to see sort of patterns and sort of started to put things together. So that's, I mean, there's more to say there, but that's sort of how I landed on the certainty trap.
Ilana Redstone is a sociology professor at the University of Illinois and author of the acclaimed book, The Certainty Trap. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Redstone on the show today. Our conversations are always intellectually stimulating, even if they leave me a little drained. She has a remarkable ability to push my thinking, raise new questions, and challenge assumptions. This is precisely why she's the ideal guest to explore the topic of certainty and how we grapple with ambiguity. So tune in to uncover the hidden pitfalls of certainty and learn how navigating ambiguity is crucial for a healthy democracy with Ilana Redstone. Well, first of all, Ilana Redstone, thanks for making time for the show. I really, really appreciate you making the time.
Well, thanks so much for having me, David. It's great to be here. Thank you.
So, you're welcome. And so I initially saw an article, somehow that crossed my radar, and but then that kind of led me to some of your prior work about it, where you introduced this idea of the certainty trap. So, and I wanted to say, in terms of the certainty trap, I'm going to quote you for just 1 second. You say the most difficult problems set in when we hold them so closely that we cease to realize their personal beliefs at all. And I think that's just so great. And we sort of talk about that kind of stuff on the show a lot. So maybe that's a good starting point to sort of jump off from.
So part of what, sometimes what people will say to me in this work, and I do want to sort of explain a little bit more of what I mean by the certainty trap, because it raises all kinds of questions for people. It's usually I get some response that's like, oh, that makes a lot of sense, but what do you mean? Like, are you like, it raises, and then the questions start churning. But with respect to that quote, sometimes what I'll hear are things like, well, what you're doing is really similar to essentially an argument for more intellectual humility or more curiosity, or right, or the, and which is to some extent true, right? There's a lot of overlap between what I'm describing and those things. The difference, I would say, which is pretty important, is that by the time you, and this goes actually right to the title of your podcast, this, outrage overload. By the time you realize that you're lacking intellectual humility in something, like, oh, I should question my assumptions here, or maybe I should be a little bit more curious here, or maybe I shouldn't jump the gun on this assumption or that assumption or the other. By the time you realize that, you're sort of halfway there already. And so what I'm saying is actually what we should be paying attention to, you call it outrage. It's that sense of the answers are simple. Anyone who disagrees is an idiot or hateful in some way. And right, like that's what you should be, because if we accept this premise that the things we care about the most are morally and ethically complicated, then anytime we start to see them as simple, that should be our cue to say, okay, what exactly is going on? Like and being sort of willing to question your own thinking. And the reason I would say this matters, I mean, like if you take an organization, and you probably talk to people from these organizations like Braver Angels or something like that, right? Where you're taking, so I want to just make the direct connection between what I'm saying and the kind of work that they're doing. Like if you're taking, and I know they do lots of different things, just to use them as an example, but one of the things that they do is, this sort of idea, we're going to take, a red person and a blue person and put them together and kind of let them see the humanity. And we know from lots of examples, we know the importance of sort of being able to see the humanity in somebody that you disagree with or somebody that you wouldn't otherwise like. The obvious problem is it's hard to scale, right? Like it's hard to, like, how many dyads or what, I mean, you can do groups or whatever, but like, in a country of 340 million people or whatever we are now, it's hard to scale. And so one way to think about what I'm saying with the certainty trap is that this is fundamentally a problem in how we think. One way to sort of destabilize that is with these interactions, right? Like I'm going to meet someone who I think is going to be hateful and spiteful or stupid in some way, and they're going to change my mind about how I think about them. But actually, this is something that we need to be able to do, this sort of ability to challenge and question our own thinking in a room by ourselves, right? It's not just about the interaction. The interaction is the outcome of the thinking that we should be doing on our own, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, it does. And but I'm also aware of how challenging that can be, right? I mean, I do these, what I call these street outrage interviews. And so one thing I've noticed about that is, and it's true for all of them, I'm sure it probably happened to me if I was on the other side of the mic. And, where like they're doing the thing that we're talking about right now, and they have that blind spot to it. Like we don't see it when we're doing it.
No. And I'm probably guilty of that too. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we all are.
Right. I think that's why it's sort of an ongoing commitment. I don't think it's not like, oh, I've figured this all out and I'm there and I'm done. Like, it is, and by it, I'm saying this commitment to sort of questioning our thinking and questioning certainty and part of it is just being clear in our thinking. It is hard. You started out by making this point that it is hard to do. That's 100% true. And actually you could make a stronger case than that, not just that it's hard, but why would I want to do that? Like, why would I want to question, like, okay, to me, like you're saying this, blah, 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 like that all sounds really nice, but like, why? That sounds like a lot of work. And frankly, it sounds fairly thankless. And why would I do that? And so which is a totally fair question. The reason is because of because I think that we have gotten to a point where we dramatically underestimate the costs of not doing it. So if you start from, so I'm going to get really, this is going to sound really abstract, but I'll try and bring it down. If you think about democracy, so there's lots of conversations now about, different threats to democracy. There was actually just a letter that came out, even from the presidential libraries, for former presidents, right? This letter that came out where they all came together, or almost all of them came together and basically put out a public letter. You can find this online, like about their concerns, sort of from Democratic and Republican presidents in the past, concern about threats to democracy. Now, depending on where you are on the political spectrum, you'll either see those threats to democracy as, and I'm going to oversimplify here, but as, the people on the right who won't accept the outcomes of the outcome of the 2020 presidential election, or you'll see it as, the threats to free speech and self-censorship that are imposed by sort of woke political correctness or whatever. So, and I'm not saying that I'm not even getting into whether I think these are equivalent or whatever, but just where you sit will tell you, but they're united by this concern about threats to democracy. So democracy, however you think about the threats, the one thing that democracy needs is it is basically built on the idea that we are all of us, including the people that or especially the people we disagree with, are capable of reasoned thought, are capable of not just reason, but reasonable thought. In other words, I can explain to you, there's a thought process, a chain of thinking in how I got to my position that I'm for affirmative action or opposed to affirmative action, or I think we should build a wall, or I think we should open the borders, or whatever. There's a chain of thinking that sort of got me there, and I can explain it to you, and that you believe that fundamentally we're all capable, not without exceptions, I'm not saying there aren't lunatics, but that we're all capable of reasonable thought. That democracy depends on that idea. It's particularly a democratic republic where you're relying on representation. If you start to believe that half the country is either racist, stupid, a woke sheep, whatever, some other kind of bigot, whatever it is, then you have two choices. Either, as far as I see it, either you're going to face a really uncomfortable sort of question about whether democracy is still the right form of government, right? If you're literally ready to write off half of the country as just idiots or whatever, horrible and hateful in some way, then how can you function? This is where people get into these sort of ideas about, well, we would need a national divorce. Okay, divorce is not an option here. So that's one option. I don't think most people don't want that option. The only other option is to get back to a place where we understand, if we really think that the people who our citizens, our co-citizens, I guess, in this democracy are capable of reasoned thought, is to commit ourselves to understanding where they're coming from and why we disagree. That's a much bigger and more important project than just, I'm going to figure out the humanity in this person who disagrees with me. This is so if you're with me so far, the thing that keeps us judging people who disagree, like this person's right, the demonization, the dismissal, that is certainty. It is some belief, value, or principle that we're holding on to as inviolable. This thing cannot be questioned or touched. I don't even say it out. It's so obvious, I won't even say it out loud. It's essentially the thing that gives us permission to write off everyone else. And so that's what I'm saying, is that's sort of where I'm interested and where my focus is. And the reason, so this is a long answer to your question about, well, that's your observation, really, that sounds hard. It is hard, but the reason to do it is because you're talking about actually the foundation that democracy sits on. And so if you care about that, and this is, I say this with students all the time, I'm like, that's fine. You can hold on to your, how you're thinking. You don't have to change a thing, but then don't come tell me that what you're concerned about is political polarization, because it just doesn't make any sense. If this is something that you're actually that you're worried about, here's how this works. You can choose to ignore it, but then understand the implications of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love this. I just want to throw out everything that I had written down for questions and stay on this, because we're sort of rolling this back to a higher level. We're sort of, unpeeling the onion. I don't know, whatever metaphor works. But we're taking this to a higher level. That is what I think is, and I think it's what's missing a lot of times in these conversations, right? So we're getting back, and you talk about how some of those fundamental sort of assumptions that put us into this certainty mode are where we are sort of this more of the root problem, if I've sort of read your stuff correctly.
100%. Yeah, absolutely.
And sort of figuring out, I guess, what they are And then
Yeah.
how do you recognize them in yourself? I guess maybe is the place I want to think about.
So first of all, it's hard. Like it's hard. It takes thought. And again, the reason that every time you sort of bump up against the, why am I doing this? Okay. It's because of this connection that I just explained. And I do like, again, like, so I have students 15 weeks this, for each two semesters a year. And I will find over the course of a semester, even now, like this, I have a great class right now, a social problems class. And I have to, like, as we go along through the course of our work together, like I am like, okay, remember this is why this is hard. But this is why we said it matters. And it's like a continual reminder of sort of what we're doing. But the way, so here, there's a couple of things to, I think, be clear about. So the way certainty works and so, I don't really see I'll just step back and say, I don't really view what I'm saying as like a theory or an argument. And maybe I've just so drank my own Kool-Aid. Like you could say, well, you're really deep in it, but I think I'm just describing what is. Like this is just kind of what the way the world is. And we can choose to ignore it, or we can decide that other things are more important or whatever. And by that, what I mean is certainty does a couple of things. So one is, when it comes to sort of the physical world, like the world we live in, the relationships between social phenomenon, the causes of inequality, the right solutions to inequality, the relationship between gender and biology, whatever it is, all of the way these social phenomenon interact, those relationships are not certain, right? Like science, I mean, your audience will know this, I'm sure. Like science is not about certainty. It's not about definitive answers. There's no moment when the final whistle blows, when we're done. Like it's not how it works. So there's this piece of it that's just recognizing the fun, and that doesn't mean, to be clear, that doesn't mean that, oh my God, we can't know anything at all, right? Like it doesn't mean that we stop teaching evolution in schools, right? Because, well, we can't really know, because there is a difference between certainty and confidence, right? Like you can have if you think of a spectrum from 0 to 1, and certainty are the endpoints. I'm saying when it comes to how we understand the world, chop off the 0 and the 1. Now I understand the irony is that you then create new endpoints, but let's just forget that. Let's just forget that for the moment, because it doesn't work for my metaphor. So let's ignore the 0 and the 1. And then you're on a spectrum of confidence. Evolution, we should teach evolution, not because we're 100% certain that it's like, there's no chance that anything, right, could ever change our theory of evolution, but because we can be really confident in what we're saying. And here's why, right? And here are the things that move us along that spectrum of confidence. So there's nothing in what I'm saying about uncertainty that says everything that we understand about the world is suddenly a coin flip. But what I am saying is that there's a big difference from going from, if you think about that spectrum again, going from 1 to 0.99 is qualitatively different than going from 0.99 to 0.98. And I'm saying that sort of when it comes to understand, that's the space where we can question our own assumptions, where we can question our thinking. So that's one piece of the certainty side. Then there's the whole sort of, and these, I'm going to describe these as though they're separate, but they're all kinds of feedback loops. And there's also the sort of moral kind of what's right side of it. And that certainty actually has a different role in that. So one way to think about it would be to say, well, what are you saying? Like you're making an argument to me, you're making an argument for moral relativism that we can't really say what's right and what's wrong. That's actually not what I'm saying. That's one way to interpret this argument, but that's actually not what I'm saying. What I'm saying when it comes to the moral side is that what certainty does when we treat the answers as though they're obvious is it gives us, without even realizing that this is what's going on, it gives us permission to not be clear about our assumptions, our values, or what we're trying to optimize for. It's the difference between saying, and that's not the same thing as saying you can't say what's right and what's wrong. So I'll give you an example. So let's say I'm having a conversation with somebody who doesn't think women should be allowed to drive. Right. And I use this example because it's in this country anyway, people all over the political spectrum would largely be on the same page. And so if I'm having a conversation with somebody who says, I don't think women should have the right to drive, one way for me to disagree is to be like, well, that's really misogynistic, right? Like you're obviously a misogynist. And maybe that's true. I'm not, my point is not about whether that's true or not. But that would be one way to disagree. Now I'm hanging my argument on an assumption about that person's intent, about what I mean by the word misogynist, right? Like, which is probably not what that person means by the word misogynist, versus I could say, I think women should have equal rights under the law. And to me, this is the right to drive is part of that. Or I think something like, I think everyone should have the right to pursue their economic potential to the fullest possible, to the most of their capability. And I think having being able to drive is an integral part of that. As long as I'm not hanging my argument on my assumptions about the other person's intent or character, I'm hanging it on my own principles. And as long as I'm willing to have those principles questioned, like someone could say to me, okay, so you think women should have equal rights under the law. Like, are there any exceptions to that? Like, what about the draft? Like, how do you, right? Like, as long as I'm willing to have that questioned, I'm good. I don't have to let it go. Right? Like, I can absolutely hold on to it and say, this is, and so when people ask me, and I'll stop in a second, like sometimes people will ask me, like, are you saying that slavery is okay or that the Holocaust was fine? No, it's actually those. But what I'm saying is those are actually the easy examples because they violate so many principles, right? Like, so I could actually say, the Holocaust, slavery, whatever, those are wrong. And again, these are extreme examples. Those are wrong because every life has equal moral value. Because I don't think any person should be enslaved, period, full stop, right? Like whatever. Like they're so obviously in violation of core principles that we can put words to, that they're almost easier. And so what I'm saying, it's not that you can't declare things right or wrong. It's that your commitment is you're making an intellectual commitment. If you're trying to avoid the certainty trap, is what I'm saying, to being really clear about what it is that you're assuming. I'm assuming that, immigration, we should have no border. I'm taking extreme case. We should have no border. Part of that is because if this is the argument I'm trying to make, maybe part of that is because I'm assuming, and this would usually go unsaid, that the purpose of an immigration policy is to benefit people who are fleeing from countries in worse conditions, right? We wouldn't even think to say that out loud. Whereas someone else might be coming at it and saying, well, no, my assumption is that an immigration policy, the right or the best immigration policy is one that's going to protect workers that are already in the host country. It's not about providing the best, right? I don't even know how you make sense of what the best immigration policy is if you haven't had the first conversation. So this is all about clarity. It's not about, so that moral piece and that piece about what's right is really about being clear and specific. Which certainty tells us we don't need to do.
Yeah, I mean, I love this because, again, it kind of is going back to something that, is kind of like one of my little hobbies, I guess, is this idea of many times we are making an argument and the assumption, it's just fun. It's like a red herring. It's just fundamentally wrong. Like our basic assumption, or 3 or 4 of those assumptions were wrong. And we're not aware of it because of this idea of certainty. And if you start to do this idea, the certainty trap, you're throwing out all that nuance.
Yeah, you're throwing out nuance. And the thing is that nuance it's always uncertainty. I mean, I had this interesting exchange with Carlo Rovelli one time. We had a short email exchange. So he's a theoretical physicist who's written a number of books. One he wrote about the Heisenberg, it was about quantum theory basically, but written for like a lay person. And we had this email exchange about certainty because I was asking him all these questions about sort of how, as a physicist, like how do you think about sort of knowledge and certainty in science? And he had this quote one time that he gave me permission to use, but it was something like somewhere, it's in the book, the Certainty Trap book. So somewhere between certainty and chaos is where mankind does it, or humankind does its business.
Right. Right.
That's just, and the more we sort of fail to recognize that, the worse off. Now, I mean, I will say that what I'm saying about certainty and the links to democracy and it has implications obviously as well for how we think about the pursuit of truth and right, like the idea where like with respect to truth, I would say it requires quite like understanding the importance of uncertainty. All it requires with respect to truth is just an understanding that our search for truth is ongoing. I mean, if you think mathematically, it's asymptotic. Like it approaches the x-axis and never crosses it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's sort of, yeah, I mean, it kind of comes back to a little bit of what you were saying about science. There's sort of a lot of fundamental, a lot of people have sort of a fundamental misunderstanding. Like they'll say, oh, science has proven this thing. And science never wants to say, it never will say that they proved a thing. It hasn't been disproven yet, or it has a larger body of evidence, or it's passed through more attempts to disprove it.
But I think it has relevance for your listeners and for the topics that you cover, right? So if you think that certainty underlies outrage, right? Like, how do you justify outrage if you're not certain, right? Like certainty, I mean, it is the thing that justifies outrage. Certainty that you're right, certainty that the other person is a horrible person, certainty, right? It is. So I want to make sure that link, like you could sort of drift off into this, well, science and knowledge and philosophy, but it's very directly linked to outrage.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I mean, at some level, you could say that questioning certainty, I mean, in the book, one of the distinctions that I make between there's certainty and then there's the trap, right? Like we don't really care about, this is a water bottle. Maybe I'm living in the matrix, whatever. There's some very small probability. The trap part, which is the tie to democracy, is what it does to how we view other people. That's the part that like you can set aside the sort of physics and philosophy questions and just focus on the part that has implications for democracy. And that I think is what, as far as I understand it, that is what your audience is concerned about.
Yeah, it's certainly one of them. I mean, ultimately, yeah, if you keep rolling it back, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this has been a really fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed it a lot. And, and I think it's great to be able to look at this a little, not just kind of have the standard canned kind of ways that we talk about things. I really like this peeling back a little further and looking at those root causes. But I really enjoyed this a lot. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks. I'm glad to be here.
That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.